Kia ora koutou. Thanks for coming in on time. We're just going to give folks another couple of minutes to join in. Kia ora koutou. For those who are just joining us, we're just going to give folks another minute or two to join the call. Great. Okay, we'll get started. Tēnā koutou katoa, and welcome to our webinar on contemporary issues in AI and privacy. This webinar is brought to you by Privacy Week, an initiative supported by the Privacy Commissioner to promote the discussion of privacy. This presentation is independent of the Privacy Commissioner, and the views expressed are personal to the speakers. As the regulator, the Privacy Commissioner may have different views to those expressed in this presentation. And I'm going to close the participant tab because there's over 200 of you here, and I honestly was not expecting that many people to be on this webinar. So thank you very much for joining us for the next hour or so. Apparently AI is a hot topic at the moment. Just in case you haven't noticed, a bunch of people wrote their own talk submissions independently for Privacy Week. And then when the program was released, it turned out that about a third of the talks are about AI. I think we all know why this isn't a coincidence, and the broader impacts of AI development are pretty profound. But Ellen and I both believe that tomorrow is not doomsday, and we all still have time to keep working on the checks and balances that will allow us to ensure that AI is a tool used effectively for the betterment of society, and that the science fiction dystopias remain science fiction. I'm going to spend about 20 minutes or so of today's talk presenting the issues in the collection of training data for AI, and then Ellen will discuss how AI is changing how we think about privacy. Please do feel free to put your questions in the Q&A along the way, and we'll have a Q&A session at the end with both Ellen and myself chipping in with some of our thoughts. So firstly, for those of you who may not know me, I have a PhD in computer systems engineering, and my background is in AI and machine learning. I worked on computer vision for what we called video analytics, which is essentially just a euphemism for surveillance. And now I'm a research fellow with Koitu, the Center for Informed Futures. My area of research is in public sector use of digital technologies, and over the last couple of years have done quite a lot of work on digital contact tracing for COVID-19, police use of facial recognition, and public sector use of algorithms. So, training data, fuel for AI. My part of the talk today focuses on training data for AI, and I do want to acknowledge my colleagues on the Hidden Humans in AI project, which was a research project funded by the University of Auckland Transdisciplinary Ideation Fund last year. And some of the themes and ideas I'll talk about today stem from that work. So what is training data? Well, AI systems learn patterns. It's pretty fundamental to how they operate and improve over time. And so, for example, we could show an AI system lots of images of pets, and we might tell the AI that some of these are cats and some of these are dogs. And what the AI will do when it's learning is it will look for patterns, the similarities and the differences that might allow for that AI system to mathematically distinguish an image of a cat from an image of a dog. And you can kind of think of this process of teaching an AI like teaching a baby or a toddler. You kind of have to repeat the same story again and again to build the connections in the brain that say, this is a cat, this is a dog, or A is for apple, and that this shape in this book corresponds to an apple. So we have to show examples to the AI in order for it to learn. And we have two types of data here in this context. There are AI systems that can cope with both. We have systems that use correct answers. So the data comes with labels, and when we call that supervised learning. And we have systems that come without the correct answers, which are unlabeled, and we call that unsupervised learning. As far as this talk is concerned, generally we're talking about labeled data because that's where that's the type of data you generally need to have a really accurate system. And so most AI systems need a lot of examples. We're not just saying show the same book to the baby and hope that they'll figure it out. You need thousands to millions or hundreds of millions of data points to really be able to solve some of the more complex problems that AI systems are able to solve today. And the quality of that data is pretty critical. So again, imagine that you wanted to teach a baby what a car is, and the only picture that you had was of a bright red convertible, and you just keep showing the baby that picture, and you keep saying, this is a car, this is a car. And the baby then goes outside and they see a big blue ute. Would they be able to identify that as a car? Probably not, right? And this is where we have to think about what is that training data that we're feeding into the AI system. And this is pretty profound effects because we know, for example, that if you're training an AI facial recognition system and you only show it images of white faces, and then you actually use it out in the open and there are faces from other races or ethnicities, that AI system wouldn't work so well on those other faces that it's never seen before. And we call that AI system biased. But one of the challenges is that when we say that the AI system is biased, people think that the system itself is biased, when often the issue stems in the training rather than the math that is done on that data. So how do we source training data and where do we get it from? Well, data sets need to represent reality in order to teach the AI something useful so that it can operate in that reality. It's really easy to generate toy examples of AI systems with 100% accuracy on fake problems. But if you want an AI system to be able to deal with the messiness of the real world, you need real data. When we build or buy a data set, the question is sort of how confident are we that this genuinely represents reality? We can face issues like overrepresentation of the general case, of the normal case, and not having enough examples of edge cases or even no representation of edge cases, which can lead to the AI system failing when it encounters anything that sits outside of those normal conditions. So we have small curated niche data sets for specific problems, and we have really large unwieldy general data sets that are the ones that are currently being used for things like GPT. And cost becomes a really significant factor in collecting enough data while also somehow needing to manage that data quality. And so if we want to have an accurate AI system, generally we need labeled data. The question is, where do we get those labels from? Because it can be one thing to go out on the internet and just like scrape the internet and collect a whole bunch of data. It's another to have correct answers associated with that data in the context of our AI system. So I'm going to talk about two examples. Firstly, we can try and collect data with labels where the data is conveniently labeled for us. So let's say we're building a facial recognition algorithm. The data is images of faces. The labels are the names that are associated with those faces. And conveniently, if you go on social media, the profiles have lots of faces and matching names. And also, so do news articles with photos and captions. There's enough of them out there that a company called Clearview AI claims to have over 30 billion images of people's faces with multiple images for each face. Multiple images for each person. And so there are pretty obvious privacy impacts of harvesting this open source information. Just because it's publicly available doesn't mean that individuals have consented to its use in AI systems. We also have, and then of course, there's a sliding scale of user participation and consent. So we've recently seen image generation systems that are pulling art and drawings from the open internet, and you know that these are using people's real artwork because you see these little artifacts in the bottom right-hand corner, which stem from the artist signatures that were on the original artwork. Clearly unconsented. Big tech companies are training their AI systems. And that's clearly unconsented. We then have sort of big tech companies that are training AI systems using user data as allowed under their terms and conditions. And that's arguably consented because the users have agreed to the terms and conditions. You can argue whether or not that is a valid form of consent. More interestingly, I think now in the context of ChatGPT, we've got people who are actually entering sensitive or confidential personal information into ChatGPT, which actually tells you that they will use that data for training purposes. And again, you can get into an argument about whether or not people are actually reading these disclaimers, but you can argue in a sense that people have consented because they're knowingly doing this, right? I guess the point here is that when we're talking about labeled data for AI systems, that question of consent does differ significantly between these different approaches. And there are a lot of other intersections with things like copyrights, intellectual property, and contract law. The other type of labels that we might try to get are human-annotated labels. So in a different example, we might be building an sentiment analysis algorithm. So an algorithm that tries to read a piece of text and tells you whether it's the person who wrote it is happy or sad or angry or whatever. And so your data might be transcriptions or conversations, and the labels would be the emotional state of the speaker. And in this case, there wouldn't be any labels associated with that data that you're collecting from the wild. Researchers used to just label their own data, but this doesn't scale very well when you want to have millions and millions of data points. So we have websites like Amazon's Mechanical Turk, which allow you to set up tasks that ask contract workers to label that data. And here's an example where workers are prompted to click on the labels. So for each sentence, they're being asked, is this neutral? Is this joy, sadness, fear, anger, surprise, or disgust? Here's another one where the workers are asked to classify the type of room the photo shows. And this is being used for real estate photography to be able to say, well, this is a kitchen, living, bathroom, bedroom, or outside. And you can argue that it's honest work for people to be paid to click on buttons. But why stop at Mechanical Turk? Labeling labor can be actually much cheaper. So we saw recently that OpenAI was paying an outsourcing consultancy less than $2 an hour to individual workers to label data that was too toxic for other crowd working platforms. And sometimes that data was in fact illegal. In Finland, you've got inmates who are unpaid to label AI data through a private company. And this is actually pitched as a way to help those prison workers upskill with computers. And you've got captchas, which present a barrier for users to get to the service they need under the guise of checking if you're a human or a bot, which actually have been collecting labels for training data for the last decade or so. And hey presto, you can have free labeling effort at scale. So our research work has defined 4 characteristics which describe the most egregious use of free human labor to produce labeled training data. And I'm going to use the captcha example to further explore those. So you go to a website and you want to buy tickets for a concert, but before you can pay, you're presented with a pop-up that's asking you to click on all of the images of traffic lights. There are 9 images shown. The system might actually know the correct answer for about half of these and uses your responses to those images to determine whether you're human or not. But the system doesn't know the correct answer for the other half. And if you pass the humanness test on the half that it does know, it assumes you have labeled the other images correctly and then saves those into a data set to later train autonomous vehicles. What are the problems with this? So firstly, there's a lack of awareness that you didn't know that your action of clicking on these images would be used to train AI systems. There's a lack of consent. You didn't get asked if you would like to provide that label or not. You're forced to do it in order to access the website. There's a lack of wage because you're not being paid anything to provide your data, to provide your labor. And fourthly, there's a lack of transparency and that you weren't told, you were told that this was a humanness test, but the role of collecting labels is hidden from you. And the reason why I'm talking about label exploitation during Privacy Week is that there are actually very similar overlaps with the privacy principles But what we're doing in our research project is rephrasing it in the language of labor exploitation to see if that is considered a higher level of sort of ethical principle than perhaps privacy. And I guess one of the questions is, how have we let the tech giants get away with this for so long? One of the issues with the capture example is that it feels very insignificant at the individual level. But when we consider how many captures are being done by all internet users every day, it becomes very material at scale. But the challenge is that we've now let this become normal as part of interacting with the internet. It's become accepted. And that's one of the challenges that we're seeing with AI training data, is that a lot of the ways and methods of collecting that AI training data actually probably do breach, privacy principles, ethical principles, but they've been done that way for the last 10 plus years that researchers now say, well, that's acceptable, that's normal. And the regulatory or legislative response to that has been too slow to really stop that from becoming the norm. We're starting to see some of that happening now, but it's slow and it's lagging behind the time. So we do have 2 papers accepted on these topics around hidden humans and training data, going into these issues in more depth. Let me know if you're interested in a notification when these papers are actually published. So what can go wrong with AI training data? So firstly, we have implications on that data quality. So you've probably heard of bias and discrimination. A lot of this stems from individual bias of the people who are developing these systems. And really interesting example is in facial recognition, where for a long time, people said, oh, facial recognition systems inherently can't process Asian faces very well. What was actually happening was that these were facial recognition systems being developed in Western countries on Western data sets that didn't have very many Asian faces in them. You go to China and you ask how their facial recognition system is working, and it's pretty good on Asian faces because that's the data that they have. So one of the challenges here is actually that the data sets reflect the bias of their collectors, and it can be really hard to recognize that until it's too late. A second issue is that there is a lack of transparency for the individuals whose data is going into these training data sets. The individuals themselves can't critique that their data is going into a data set because the data sets are privately owned or held, and they're not publicly available, they're not open sourced. They probably shouldn't be a publicly available open source because that would release a lot of people's personal information out into the ether. But what happens here is that those who pay to acquire and label that data, the bargain is that they need to receive the economic benefit of doing that, but that means that the users are left unaware. And that this leads to distrust. That's what we're kind of seeing at the moment, is people become more aware of this training data problem, that people are starting to say, well, hold on a minute, I didn't consent to that. This doesn't seem fair. What can we do to make it more fair? And something for the privacy officers to think about is that there is actually a risk of reverse engineering that data that was used to train the AI system. So the developers might tell you that the training data is kept securely in a cloud server, will never release it, is kept very carefully. But what people who really want to figure out what data is in that training data set can do is that they can just throw random data at the AI system and see that output performance. And if they can see that the output performance is really highly accurate, then that's a sign that the data that they threw at that AI system was probably in the training data set. So there is the opportunity for that private data to potentially be leaked unintentionally. So there are 3 characteristics of digital data that underpin these training data issues that are really broadly applicable to a lot of other privacy issues, and it's kind of useful to kind of think about that. These are characteristics of data that make it particularly, digital data, that make it particularly susceptible to these privacy challenges. Firstly, we have data persistence. Data is now existing longer, infinitely long, can be retained forever. And in particular, it can be retained for longer than the lifespan of the human subjects that created it. And that makes it really tricky to apply some of those privacy principles. Data can be repurposed because it's non-rivalrous, so it can be reused beyond its original imagined purpose, particularly without communicating that to the original user. You don't have to collect that data from the original user again. And we have data spillovers, where that data, we can have secondary capture where data is collected on people who are not the original target of the data collection. So for example, you might have somebody who is using an email system who consents for their emails to go into an AI training system to do better text prediction. The problem is that email was actually a conversation between two parties and only one of them has consented. The other one may not actually have consented, but their data has been captured by this process anyway. So what are some of the things that we might be able to do about these issues? The privacy principles do go a long way towards helping protect people from the harms of bad training data. At a governance level, as privacy practitioners, we should be working with others in our organizations to prevent misuse of collected data. If we're developing AI systems, ask where that training data is coming from and ensure that it has been collected ethically and in line with the information privacy principles. And lastly, ensure that the data that we collect is only being used for those intended purposes. Because when we look at the range of issues in the digital age, a lot of them do stem from secondary use where data is being repurposed for use that wasn't what the user originally thought the data was going to be used for. So that's me, Ngāmihi Nui ki koutou. Thank you for listening. You can find me on Twitter while that service still remains available, or otherwise I'm pretty responsive to emails. I'll now hand the floor over to Alan, and then we'll do some questions and answers after that.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And thank you, Angharad and Emma, and everybody at the Office of the Privacy Commissioner for keeping this thing running behind the scenes. And thank you all in the meeting chat right now for tuning in. I'm just getting my window set up. Apologies for this brief glimpse into the vortex. So, I am Alan Robbins. I am a senior consultant at the Brainbox Institute, which is a public interest consultancy and think tank focusing on the intersection between technology, law, and policy. Andrew did a deep dive into kind of data collection and labeling practices, and I'm going to be doing a little bit more of covering the waterfront of impacts that AI is having on privacy. I think Andrew may have oversold me slightly when he said that I would be talking about how AI is changing the way we think about privacy. While it's not 100% bad, I'm afraid to report that right now AI is mainly undermining privacy. But we'll get into why and how right now. There are 4 big impacts that AI is having on privacy right now. Number 1, it is driving the collection of more data to train AI. 2, it's reducing the effectiveness of some privacy protections. 3, it's enabling new ways of collecting information and enhancing old ways of collecting information. And 4, synthetic media or generative AI, whatever you want to call it, poses unique challenges that need to be met head on. What challenges are they? Intrigue. You're going to have to wait until the end to find out, or about the middle. I spend most of the back half of this presentation talking about synthetic media, so you won't have to wait too long. First, however, AI data collection. Now, I'm not going to spend too long on this because Andrew has already covered it to great effect. However, I do want to mention that because AI is being trained to do virtually every task on the sun, or people are trying to train AI to do every task under the sun, information is being collected about things and in ways that you might not expect normally. So, for instance, what is the privacy impact of owning a Roomba, one of those adorable little robot vacuum cleaners that trundles around your house sucking up dirt? Well, a lot of people will probably say, what do you mean? There is no privacy impact to owning a Roomba unless I mistreat it, it gets angry, and it nudges my door open for robbers to come in. And that may have been true once, but for the last several years, if you owned a Roomba, if you bought a Roomba and you agreed to the privacy conditions, and you didn't go into the settings and turn this specifically off, it would make a floor plan of your house, complete floor plan, and send it back to a central server to be analyzed. Now, this was not done to spy on people. This was done to improve their overall algorithms and navigation and battery life and all those sorts of things. But it is something that makes a lot of people, including me, fairly uncomfortable, because while it may be used for one purpose, as Andrew mentioned, data can be used for many purposes, and it can be a company can be compelled to give over data to the government, and who knows what they'll do with it then. Besides, that's not Roomba's only trouble with privacy and things that happen when it collects data to train AI that then maybe aren't handled the best in its production chain, but we cannot spend all day on Roomba. We've got to move on. What Roomba would probably say about this data and the leaks is that even if it ends up getting out or government requests it, it's not explicitly connected to you because it's been anonymized. But that brings us to the second big trend, which is that AI is reducing the effectiveness of traditional privacy protections. A piece of data that's been anonymized, or a set of data that's been anonymized, is a pretty general term. You've probably clicked through some privacy terms and conditions that told you your data would be anonymized or that there would be nothing personally identifiable. What that often means in practice is that they take pieces of information that could uniquely identify you alone, like your name or your phone number or your address, and they either strip them out of the data set or reduce them. So it's rather than your name, your initials, or the first and last number of your phone number. While that does prevent somebody from, at a glance, telling you who this information is about, often there is enough information left in the data set to reconstruct with some certainty who, in fact, the data is about. And if you cross-reference that data with other data sets and other sources of information, then you can take a lot of disparate pieces of information that on their own, and even in small groups, are quite innocent and do not violate anyone's privacy, and you can combine them to learn some quite intimate, quite private things about people. What AI does is it makes that easier. It can do it more quickly, it can do it more effectively, it can draw on more data, it can do a lot of the looking for things automatically. So data anonymization practices, which already could sometimes be a bit spotty, are getting less and less fit for purpose as AI develops more and more. And it's not just big data sets that we need to worry about. AI can undermine personal privacy measures as well. A good example of this is face blurring. A lot of people will have blurred pictures of their faces that they have gone on the internet for a variety of reasons. Maybe they're activists and they don't want to be persecuted. Maybe they're sex workers and they don't want to be stalked and harassed. Whatever the reason, they had an expectation that by blurring their face, they would not be able to be identified in a photo, or at least it would be much more difficult. But AI has already been applied to this problem. And while some early attempts were not great due to some of the issues that Andrew has talked about, bias in data selection, what you have to feed in, they are getting better and better, and they are only going to get better in the future. This is not just a one-off privacy undermining thing. You can't say, well, people should stop blurring their faces, they should completely cover them in photos in the future, or edit them in some other way. This is a privacy time bomb, because there are a lot of photographs with blurred faces on the internet that people had a reasonable expectation of privacy when they posted, that are suddenly going to become a lot less private when AI develops sufficiently and is sufficiently available. Covering your face isn't enough of a solution anyway, because of our third big trend, which is that AI is enabling new ways of collecting information, and it is making old ways of collecting information more effective. An easy example of this is facial recognition when applied to cameras. A single camera or a network of cameras has a certain amount of privacy risk and concern, but that risk is exponentially increased when they can do facial recognition. No longer do you need one person watching things in real time and trying to track someone between the different cameras, or a group of people going through the back catalog of footage to try and find someone moving between them. With facial recognition, depending on how good your system is and how much processing power you have and all of that, you can track one or many or all of the people and their movements throughout your monitored area very effectively. That facial recognition has turned a camera and a network of cameras into a much, much more powerful tool for surveillance, and something much more concerning for privacy. Covering your face isn't a great solution here either, because of gait analysis. That's GAIT, as in walking gait, not GATE, although I'm sure that AI could also be trained to recognize gaits. AI can be trained to recognize the way someone walks and then track them around the city in the same way that it would if it were analyzing their face. Their face does not need to be visible. AI also enables new ways of inferring information about people in ways that wouldn't have been possible without it. I don't know how many of you are plugged into youth TikTok meme culture. I'm going to assume not a huge number of you. If all of you are, then I'm deeply sorry. I'm not actually that plugged into it. I wish I was less plugged into it than I am. But a trend that I noticed earlier this year, were people sending me screenshots of TikToks like this, where they basically say, TikTok knew I was gay before I knew. And what they mean by that is that they found TikTok serving them content like 5 things lesbians do, or how to come out to your family, or what to do when you're thinking about questioning your sexuality. And they weren't necessarily thinking about coming out or questioning their sexuality at that time, although they clearly did later. This isn't because TikTok was deliberately trying to profile them. I don't think that TikTok has a big database of its gay users somewhere, although if they wanted to, they could probably make one with passable accuracy. What it did is it just took people who liked content A in the past, then moved on to content B. This person is consuming content A, so give them content B. But all the information that they fed into this algorithm, all the information about the content they watched and how they behaved, could be used, if TikTok chose, to make certain judgments about them in ways that they're probably unaware of and have, found by turns endearing and deeply concerning. This technique can be used in a way that I think will be spun as privacy positive in some ways. While advertisers are moving away from cookies and tracking your internet browsing and behavior, there have been some moves to do things like install AI systems on phones and in chat apps that will stay on the device, not send information out directly about people, but monitor the text of conversations and the contents of pictures and analyze them, and then send insights about what it has gleaned over. So it's not sending your information directly. It is saying this person would be in the market for this product or would enjoy this entertainment thing, so advertise it to them because of the analysis we've done. This is, in some cases, being sold as this is good for privacy because we are no longer directly looking at your information, but in some ways it is, and certainly can feel, even more invasive. And we're going to have to grapple with that at some point and figure out exactly what we're comfortable with. Speaking of things that are new and somewhat uncomfortable that we're going to have to grapple with, synthetic media. We have arrived at last. It is something you are almost certainly aware of. There is a lot of hype around it. There is a lot of interest in it. It can do some pretty cool things. But what that does is it has driven something of a gold rush in the field right now. There are a lot of companies, startups, small companies, big companies, medium companies that want to move into this space and either develop their own synthetic media models or tune existing ones to give them exactly what they want. And what you need for that is a lot of data. And because this is such a new space, because, as Andrew discussed, some less than ideal trends and techniques have been normalized within the space, because regulators haven't had a chance to pivot yet, and because everybody sees this as a race to get to market, and there are likely to be few consequences for doing the wrong thing, the incentives in the space are very much towards grabbing whatever information you can get, not worrying too much about whether it's copyrighted or private for somebody, and then just rushing it out to market. And once the model is out there, it is out there. It is very, very hard to take down. If somebody downloads it onto their personal computer and then seeds it on a torrent site, it's basically impossible. And what these makers would tell you probably is that you shouldn't be too worried, because even if your personal information has been collected by these models, it's not in the models. It shaped the models, but it is not part of them now. But as Andrew discussed, you can try and figure out some of the things that may have gone into the models, and you can intentionally or sometimes unintentionally, it is increasingly being shown, get out more or less exact recreations of training data from models with the right or the wrong prompts. So this includes visual AI generation, systems like the one pictured here, but it also covers things like text. Now, visual is one issue on its own. Somebody could quite reasonably want a picture of somebody to represent a villain or like a sad sack character in an ad, and type into an AI image generation a prompt, get out a picture, assume that they're fine to use it because after all it's an AI person, but actually it's a replica of a picture of a real person and they don't appreciate being used that way. But text is, if anything, even more concerning because very sensitive information can be caught up in these models. An example is a small Chinese company that wanted to build a chatbot. It trained the chatbot partially on its own company's internal messaging services and the messages in there because they thought, well, the messages aren't going to be in the model. But it turns out you could get them out of the model, including people's private information, their addresses, details of their health problems, what they really thought about coworkers, secret office trysts. A disaster. And once the models are out there, they are out there. In addition, as Andrew also referenced, people are giving very, very sensitive information to these pieces of technology right now. They are being encouraged to by people who say, you can turn ChatGPT into a lawyer, you can turn it into your therapist, you can turn it into your doctor. Just use this prompt and then type in the intimate details of your mental health issues or your legal troubles or that weird bunion that you're worried about. And that information stays with OpenAI and they can use it to train future versions of ChatGPT or for any one of any number of different things. So these are all issues that are currently plaguing synthetic media because of the maturity stage that it's at, because it's new, because there's a lot of hype around it, because people are rushing. In time, hopefully, people will calm down a little bit, they'll be a little bit more measured, and there will be more of a move towards using it responsibly and for things that it's actually good at rather than trying to turn a language model into your therapist. However, there are some things that are always going to be problems no matter how far we move away from this moment of hype, because they are inherent to the way that these synthetic media models operate. They can be used to create highly convincing video, audio, well, not highly convincing video yet, but highly convincing pictures and audio, and video is coming, of people doing and saying many, many things. While it is somewhat hard to get too rowdy with the big models that are out there now, there are open source, uncontrolled models that are growing in capability. And as I keep on saying, all of this is only going to get better. This has a number of privacy implications. First of all, they can be used to just invade people's privacy directly. You can use a vocal AI synthesis model to impersonate somebody that someone trusts and get information out of them. You can use it for scams. You can use it to invade their privacy traditionally. You can also use it for harassment and produce images and audio of people saying and doing things that they never did. This happened before I was with Brainbox, so it doesn't technically count as bragging. But in 2019, Brainbox produced a report on synthetic media called Perception Inception, in which they argued that whether or not information about you was produced by you or produced by an AI, whether or not it's true or false, information about you should be considered personal information. And that means that the amount of potential personal information out there about everybody is going to be massively, massively increasing. In the past, you could only apply these systems to relatively prominent people, people who had hours and hours of audio of their voices out there, people who had thousands upon thousands of pictures of their face. But they've developed so fast that all you need is 5 minutes of audio and a few photographs of somebody's face, probably from social media. And anybody with those things out there, and in the age of social media, that's most people, could have these techniques applied to them very effectively and produce all sorts of fake but personal information about them. In the past, this has largely been used to harass female public figures, whether they're politicians or journalists or actresses, to produce deepfake porn, which is used then for harassment or just for whatever the makers want to use it for. Brainbox noted in 2019 that we have the legal infrastructure to come out and say that that's illegal in New Zealand. I don't believe that it's happened yet, but we continue to say probably should come out and clarify that that's not illegal and we shouldn't allow it. But there are so many problems that are going to be created by this explosion of potential personal information about absolutely anybody with any kind of profile online that we are going to need to deal with. And I do not have easy solutions for that. And apologies that this talk has been a little bit of a downer. It's not all bad in terms of AI impacts on privacy, but the overall ones are pretty grim. So that's my talk. Thank you for listening. We're going to be opening up questions now. If you have any other questions that go beyond this session, feel free to get in contact at brainbox.institute. And I should have mentioned this at the start, but in writing the script for this talk, I decided also that I was going to turn it into a blog post on the Brainbox blog. So if you are interested in having some notes on this discussion, or at least on my part of this discussion, then you can go to the blog section in, I don't know, a week or so, however long it'll take me to get it up, and you can find it there. Thank you very much. We'll be opening up questions now.
Great, thanks very much, Alan. So yeah, in the interest of time, we'll crack straight into some questions. There's 2 there so far. I'm sure that there's going to be a lot more coming in. So the first one's asking, how realistic is it for people to send random data to an AI to discern if that data was in the data set? It seems unlikely you could find something you didn't know was already there to me. And I think the first thing that I would say academically is to encourage you to have a look at the literature on adversarial AI or adversarial threat models against AI systems. There's been a lot of research. I think Alan had some examples on his slides that showed, you can get these AI systems to spit out answers that were actually very, very close to what was in the training data. One of the things that most people don't see when they use an AI system is that actually, because these AI systems tend to be probabilistic, there is a confidence score attached to any response or output that an AI system gives. And if you have access to that, that can be a really strong indicator that a piece of input data that you've given to that AI system is something that it's seen before, because it comes up with a really, really high level of confidence, higher than what probably it should be having. And that can be an obvious sign that that data was in the training set. Alan, anything you want to add here?
Nope, I think that covered it pretty well. From my perspective, the problem is, yeah, you can try and use these techniques to find out what was in the data set, but like the big thing is just them spitting stuff out, even for relatively innocent prompts, if it's close enough to something that's already in there.
Cool. I just encourage everybody to also use the upvote function so that we can see which questions are more relevant and important, because we will probably run out of time. Alan, what advice would you give to organizations and agencies who are thinking about using generative AI? How can we still get the benefits but ensure the safeguards are there, or just don't do it?
It is a difficult tightrope to walk right now, especially because so many of the biggest systems and the most effective ones and the ones you'd probably want to use are ones that have been built with the techniques that Andrew talked about being a little bit irresponsible, scraping things, including a lot of copyrighted data, including people's personal information. If you want to use it as a business, I would say, 1, try and make sure that you are being as careful as possible with what you're generating. Be very, very careful with, pardon me, be very, very careful with what you're typing in. Make sure that you have systems to catch anything that could be of concern that gets spit out by those systems. Do not rely on them too much, because there are big unsolved questions about copyright and whether or not you actually can legally use for business purposes. These services will tell you you own the outputs of the AI systems that we create, but that is still a legal open question. I wouldn't say absolutely don't do it, but there are things that you can do to be more safe and more careful and avoid betting the house on systems that could be damaging or could just not end up being legally very usable. I'm sure that my Brainbox viewers would also say, hire us to tell you how to do it, and we'll take a deep look at your systems and let you know how to do it the best.
Great. We've got a hot question here. Are you aware of any cases where AI is being used with the specific intent of enhancing privacy? And I think the obvious answer to that is yes, there are people out there who have AI systems that are intended to enhance privacy. Most generally, in terms of redacting or like suppressing information so that it doesn't then get leaked or get out there. I would say the challenge that I have with any technological response to enhancing privacy is that it's a what's the term? I'm losing the term. Where two sides have weapons and they're like, it's an arms race. There you go.
Yeah.
It's an arms race, right? Like any technological response will be met with other technological responses to the original responses, right? So it's always going to just be a race to the bottom, and we need additional protections beyond technology to be able to be confident that the harms are going to be sufficiently mitigated. Alan, anything you want to add on that?
Yeah, I'll just throw in some specifics, I guess. So there are AI systems that people have used to, for instance, maintain for documentaries where they're talking about sensitive things. They have techniques that they've used to change somebody's face but still retain the emotion that they have and the facial expressions they're making, and change their voice but still retain tones and intonation in that. Automatic systems for finding people's personal information that has been flagged as like spreading without their permission and taking it down automatically. And there are, as Andrew said, techniques to kind of redact data. There's an interesting technique called synthetic data sets, where you take a real data set and then you know what you want to do with that data set, and you get an AI to analyze it and create you an entirely new one that contains no real people and no real information, but still has the same statistical features of the original data set that are relevant to you. So in that way, you can use that data set with confidence, knowing that even if it leaks, even if bits of it come out, there's not going to be any privacy problems because it's not any real people's data. However, that's cool, but it is quite limited as a tool, and people have to proactively use it. And the way things are at the moment, few people are. So there are some cool AI tools for it, but they haven't seen widespread use, and in many cases they're kind of just better versions of things that were already done.
Great. The next top question, which I think is going to be a tough one for two not lawyers. Given these concerns, do you think that the Privacy Act 2020 is fit for purpose? And what is the first thing that you would change? I think the second part of the question essentially infers what the answer to the first part is going to be. I mean, the Privacy Act 2020, when you look at the history, it's based on recommendations in a review that were done in, I think, 2013 or 2014. And it took 6 or 7 years for those recommendations to actually be turned into something that could be considered by the House and turned into legislation. So we're talking about a Privacy Act that has 2020 on the label, but was developed at, is based on recommendations that were at a time when none of this technology really existed, right? We were at the beginning of what we might call the third wave of artificial intelligence at the time. At that time, very few people would have predicted the rise of deepfakes, generative AI, all of these things that we're seeing today. Few people, not no one, but just few people. Alan, do you have anything that you want to add here first?
I'll say that I think the framing of it is having these principles and these general ideas about how we think privacy should be framed and propagated. Those can definitely be applied forward into the future. And that's a little bit what happened with the Perception and Inception report, and our work around this is the principles are there. The frameworks maybe not, but hopefully they should be able to arise from the principles because those are already agreed.
Yeah, I think what I would say is, I think the information privacy principles are a really good foundation for what we're doing and what we're working with. Those principles need to be applied in different contexts. And so, for example, we're seeing with biometrics that we actually my opinion is that we do need a biometrics code of practice to augment what we have in the information privacy principles. I think when we're looking at a lot of the issues that we've talked about today, a big challenge is extraterritoriality. So a lot of these businesses and companies that are causing some of these problems don't exist in New Zealand or exist overseas or exist across multiple territories. And being able to apply the privacy rules in a way that, with sufficient enforcement is a really significant challenge in terms of being able to protect people's rights. But actually, yeah, that reminds me, probably the most significant thing that I would like to see added to the Privacy Act is actually stronger enforcement and stronger penalties. At the moment, I think a lot of what we do relies on people wanting to do the right thing. And that might work in a country like New Zealand where people generally want to do the right thing. But the penalties are so low in the Privacy Act 2020 that there is basically no consequence for not doing things well. So that's probably my actual answer to the question. Let's come through to some of the other highly rated questions. I think we'll save one of these for the end. If we are unaware of how an AI makes decisions, how can we conduct a risk assessment with any sense of certainty? I think that's one for you, Alan.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. The short answer is you can't / it's really hard. The longer answer is you can try to get a sense of how it makes decisions from the outside by testing it in a lot of different scenarios. Ideally, these systems should be built with a view to transparency. There is certainly a big movement in that in AI at a lot of places. I mean, there are still, because of the kind of gold rush happening right now, a lot of systems that are being built that are very opaque. But certainly an opaque AI system that's a black box means that you have to do a lot more if you want to do a good risk assessment. And that just is going to involve a lot of testing. It's going to involve a lot of iteration, and probably it's going to involve retesting after you've deployed it, seeing if it's behaving the way that you expected it to behave when you actually put it out into the wild. So I'd say that using an AI system that doesn't have robust transparency features built in is a big risk, and that should be itself included in your risk assessment.
Yeah, and I would just reinforce, I think, that point about performance monitoring and auditing after deployment, right? Because I think that will be very difficult to make sure you are testing for every possible case at the time that you develop the system. That is, it's basically, from a technical perspective, impossible to genuinely cover all possible cases. Because if you could do that, you probably wouldn't use an AI system. You'd probably just use something less sophisticated that was, less probabilistic. And so, where there is uncertainty, you need to be checking that the system is performing the way that you expect it to. Here's an interesting sort of somewhat personal question. How has your knowledge of what AI does changed your behavior when you're online?
That's a good question. Honestly, it has not changed my behavior very much, but that is because I am the son of a computer science professor. Who impressed on me from a very early age that nothing online should be trusted at all. So I'm barely on social media. I tend to browse in incognito tabs that after a few weeks I will close and then reopen to reset all the tracking and prediction algorithms and content recommendation things. So I'm pretty atypical. I never developed the behaviors that I think I would have changed had I had them in the first place and then learned. But maybe I'd have just said it's worth the risk. I'm just going to carry on doing this anyway.
Yeah,
I will say it's validated my paranoia.
Yeah, I think this is related to another question here. What are practical steps individuals who use social media can do to protect themselves? Many of us already have digital identities, even if we didn't know that's what we were doing. And yeah, it is really hard to retroactively go back and fix things, because once it's out there, it's out there. Firstly, would encourage people to adopt some of the principles that come from cybersecurity. So we call it OPSEC, operational security. And there's lots of guides out there around how you can take practical steps to reduce your risk profile. So for example, not posting full body shots, images of yourself is one thing that can reduce the likelihood of you being impersonated by someone else. Not putting photos up in the first place is probably even better, but we all live in a social media driven era, and people need to use Instagram. So that we're not saying don't use the internet, because that's also probably not the right conclusion, but there are things that you can do to be safer in your use of the internet. Do you have any other practical tips, Ellen?
No, I think that's a good one. I mean, I've got some impractical tips if you want them. They vary. There are various tools that you can find online that will edit your pictures in small ways that makes them harder to read for these machine learning systems. However, as Andrew indicated with an earlier answer, that's a bit of an arms race. If you really, really wanted to kind of poison the well, you could use generative AI yourself and flood your social media feeds with pictures of things that are labeled as you that just aren't you, and make it very, very difficult for an algorithm to get a handle on you automatically. But that, that is a fair amount of effort, and it's probably going to alienate the people who are following you on social media. So decide for yourself how badly you want to enforce that level of privacy protection.
Yeah, just flood your social media profiles with trash. That's basically my Twitter profile. What should we be teaching staff about the risks to privacy, to our business, and to their privacy? And I think the first thing is just awareness, right? Like if you're not aware of these problems, then you're not going to be thinking through how that might change your behaviors. And so, talks like this, trying to help build awareness so that people can apply their own risk assessment when they're doing things, right? And they can decide, okay, well, what is the risk? Am I happy to give my data to this generative AI system because I get this service in return for it, right? Like, it's not our place to kind of say that people shouldn't be doing that, because that's an individual choice. Alan, anything you want to add on sort of, how we educate people?
Yeah. I'll add that it's likely to be very, very specific to your business. What piece of information you're concerned about, what you might be using these tools for, what people might use these tools for you. So, I mean, take stock, and I think this crosses over a little bit with a question that I think we were getting to, which is what regulations should people be aware of, should organizations be aware of as they start to ramp up their activities with AI. In New Zealand, there aren't really any specific AI regulations, but like AI is just a tool. It is a tool that allows you to do things. And just because you're using AI to do that thing doesn't mean the regular regulations don't apply to whatever you're doing. So make sure that you know exactly what you're doing with AI and you're aware of the regulations around that. You should also keep an eye on, I would say, the Digital Services Act and the AI Act that are coming up in the EU. While they are not directly going to apply to New Zealand, if you want to do business in the European Union, then you should be aware of them. You should be able to comply with them. And also, the EU is a very influential regulatory body, and we're likely to see similar approaches taken by other jurisdictions. So keep an eye on what the EU is doing and make sure that you know what you're using AI to do and what all the regulations around that are.
Yeah, something that I do want to acknowledge is that it is incredibly difficult to keep up with all of the changes, especially in the regulatory space. Just talking to Tom, who was also at Brainbox a couple of weeks ago, it feels like every week there's another report and there's another policy proposal. And if you just read all of those, you wouldn't actually have time to do anything else. So we acknowledge that it is challenging. I think Europe is probably one of the leaders in this space, and a lot of the other jurisdictions will probably wait for Europe to do it first, see if it works, and then probably copy them. So if you want to get sort of ahead of the curve, check what Europe's doing. That sort of relates to this question: how come the large language models don't just generate a privacy impact assessment for each jurisdiction's privacy laws, one for each state, country, etc.? Should just take them seconds. Alan, I think you have an answer here about the power and strength of large language models.
Yeah, I mean, large language models don't really understand anything. They are big machines that put words together in ways that words have been put together before. So they can give you stuff that looks really good, but actually asking them to do tasks that require a lot of context and analysis and thinking and care and double checking, like legal tasks, medical tasks, that sort of thing, you're going to want to, if not avoid them, use them very, very, very cautiously.
Cool. Well, thanks very much, everyone, for coming along to our talk, and thank you for all of the questions. I'm sorry that we unfortunately don't have time to get through all of them. As we indicated earlier, please do feel free to get in touch with the team at Brainbox, or you can email me. I'm generally pretty responsive with emails as long as they're reasonable, and we'll do my best to respond. I've got one last question here. Alan, your hair looks unfeasibly shiny and lustrous. I like that word, unfeasibly. It's sort of breaking the laws of physics. Is it real or artificially generated?
It is entirely real. And if you toddle over to the Brainbox site, one final plug, and get in touch via that form, I would be happy to share my hair care tips with you. And, also talk about any of the AI stuff that we've discussed here in more detail.
I was worried for a second. I thought you were going to be sending samples of your hair to people. But I'm glad that we're not going there. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa. Thank you very much, everyone. Please enjoy the rest of your day.